Association for Quality Assurance in Higher Education. We're the European network of quality assurance agencies. So we have about 55 members from across the European higher education area, and we're the representative body in the European policy making. And of course, we've been talking about microcredentials because everybody's been talking about microcredentials for a little while now, it seems. And I've been invited today to speak a little bit about perspectives of quality and quality assurance of microcredentials. The material I present today is based primarily on 2 lines of work that we've been doing at ENQA. We have a working group that's been addressing this topic. The publication of that working group is due out in the next few weeks. So keep an eye on our website if you're interested in seeing that. And we're also involved in another project, the I'm in QA project, which is linked to the Bologna follow-up group, thematic peer group on quality assurance. A bit of a long-winded way of getting there. But anyway, within that project, there's a working group on microcredentials. So what I present today is kind of drawn from both of those sources. So I will just try to share my screen. And sorry, this is always the moment that takes a few minutes. Make sure I share the correct one.
We see it right.
Now, the $1,000,000 question. Do you see the full screen version and not my notes?
We do see the correct one. Yeah.
Okay, lovely. Thank you very much. Okay, so what is the starting point? As we all know, microcredentials are not new. They've been around for a long time, but they've gained prominence, and they've gained new terminology, I think. Having said that, I don't think, what we've seen from, speaking to quality assurance agencies and also to national authorities, there's often still kind of a lack of a common understanding around what a microcredential is. And, there are a lot of definitions out there. We tend to settle around, a few common denominators, but I think it's fair to say to start with that there's still some kind of confusion around that. And within ENQA, we can't even decide whether to write it with a hyphen or not. So that's not really a great starting point. But anyway, they've been around for a while. Obviously, we're focused on them at the moment because of the sort of policy focus on how microcredentials can contribute to kind of broader issues around upskilling, reskilling, so addressing the skills gap, and also around sort of flexible learning paths for students. And the focus then transfers to quality assurance, because we need quality assurance in order to have a trust in the qualification or the certificate that comes at the end of the microcredential, which allows it to be recognized either formally or informally by other institutions for learners that might want to use it for access to higher education, but also by employers who want a guarantee of what the students have learned. But what we've also seen previous work on quality assurance of microcredentials over recent years has confirmed the applicability of the existing Bologna process tools to apply to microcredentials, and by this we mean the tools around ECTS, the tools around national qualification frameworks, and specifically for quality assurance, the standards and guidelines for quality assurance in European higher education area, ESG for short. And indeed, within the introduction of the ESG, there's a statement that the ESG are applicable to all higher education, regardless of the mode of study or the place of delivery. So from that, we take it that they apply also to microcredentials. We also take with us the sort of principle of quality assurance that the institutions have the primary responsibility for the quality and the quality assurance of the education they deliver, and that also includes microcredentials. Importantly, what we've also understood from previous work is that external quality assurance should be proportionate. And I think that's probably one of the kind of red lines throughout throughout today's presentation. And, one of the messages I always emphasize is that we need to be thinking proportionately when it comes to quality assurance. So what is the state of play? We see amongst our members that there are a very wide variety of approaches to external QA of microcredentials and a variety of stages of implementation. Some countries and agencies are at a relatively early stage in their discussions. They're just starting to kind of pull together working groups and task forces to look at how to address this, whereas other countries and systems have already quite a well-established approach to this. And I think Mark, who speaks after me, will probably mention a few examples of country approaches, and I'd be happy to complement that also in the discussion afterwards. But I think there's one important thing to highlight, that when we talk about sort of stages of implementation or stages of discussion around the quality assurance of microcredentials, that doesn't necessarily equate to the kind of maturity of the approach. It may be that agencies have had a discussion about how to address this and consider that their existing approaches, particularly if their national system is around institutional accreditation rather than program accreditation, they may feel that their existing approaches already sufficiently cover quality assurance of microcredentials offered by institutions, and that they don't need any specific framework, any specific additional framework for that. So just to keep in mind that just because a country or an agency doesn't have a specific framework doesn't necessarily mean that they haven't discussed this and taken it into account. And that very much links into my next point, which is that we see that the preference is very much to use and adapt existing approaches as far as possible, instead of introducing something completely new. And we see that, for example, in the Irish system, where they took an approach that had already been developed for smaller scale awards and adapted it also for use for microcredentials. What we do, however, see is that there's a bit of a gap when it comes to issues of recognition of prior learning by institutions, and also in terms of how microcredentials can be stacked and how they can be carried with the learner into different environments. So that's kind of area where we see a bit of a gap. And what agencies tell us is that they are looking to national and European levels for guidance as to how to take these discussions further. But when we talk about the quality of microcredentials, what is it that we're actually talking about? And when I talk about quality of education, I always preface this with the sort of disclaimer that I'm a practitioner, or I don't like to call myself an expert. I'm a practitioner in quality assurance. I'm not an expert on quality. So I always avoid the question of, what's the definition of quality education, quality higher education? And the cop-out answer is that quality is contextual. It means different things to different people in different circumstances. But when we talk about quality of education, we normally define it in relation to fitness for purpose. So is it meeting the goals that have been set? So one could ask as a starting point, what is the purpose of microcredentials, if that's how we're going to see whether they're meeting their expectations? So why is it that higher education institutions offer microcredentials? The points that you see here on the screen come from a paper back in 2015. And the authors identified a number of reasons, including increasing visibility and reputation, increasing responsiveness to student and labour market needs, and as a way to experiment with new pedagogies and technologies that perhaps using them within microcredentials is then a sort of precursor to scaling that up for use in full degree programmes. And of course, there's a financial aspect. For some institutions, it's a way to generate additional income. when I first looked at this, I thought 2015, okay, and then I stopped and realized that 2015 in the context of recent changes is actually quite a long time ago. So what's changed since 2015? I would say that all these points are still fully valid. What we might throw into the mix is an increased focus on offering flexible learning pathways for students. This ties in with attracting a more diverse group, but I think we've seen lately a more explicit focus on the flexibility of learning pathways. We see, certainly in some systems, more integration and permeability between different tertiary education systems, between higher education, vocational and professional education. And microcredentials are one way to sort of enhance student mobility between those different sectors. In countries, of course, where they differentiate, some don't. And there's also an increased focus on lifelong learning opportunities. Perhaps also the sort of overarching change is the increased strategic importance of microcredentials for higher education institutions. On the other side of the coin, why is it that learners are attracted to microcredentials? And the work that ENQA has done recently has sort of grouped learners into two categories. One category is the existing enrolled students. So those that are already undertaking a full degree program at an institution. And they might take microcredentials as elective modules that are required as part of their program, but allow them a bit of freedom to choose something perhaps from outside their study field. Students might take them as simply because they're interested for personal development, something that they're pursuing for their own personal interest. And they may also be taking them for reasons of professional development. On the other hand, we have the category which I've sort of titled lifelong learners, and see that as being those that are not enrolled in a full degree program. And here the motivation, there's some overlap, but some different. This is more likely to be around professional development, upskilling and reskilling. This might be compulsory or linked to their job, or it might be something that's entirely voluntary. We might see also learners taking microcredentials in order to access higher education, particularly if they come from, say, non-traditional backgrounds that maybe have traditionally had less access to higher education. And of course, lifelong learners also take microcredentials just because they're interested. They might want to learn French or pursue a topic that is completely unrelated to their professional life. What we do see is that those that fall into the category of lifelong learners tend to be much more diverse than enrolled students. And this, of course, can have significant implications for course and curriculum design, because they come with very different kind of prior knowledge. There may be a need for different kind of teaching approach and mode of delivery. What does all this mean for the way that microcredentials are delivered? Again, here we've sort of identified two models that higher education institutions use. The first one could call kind of the easy approach, is the unbundling of existing programs. So taking a module or a course that's offered as part of a degree program and extracting it from the framework of that degree program and offering it as a standalone course. And so the content for these is probably developed through the institution's usual curriculum design processes. But what it does require is some additional reflection on how that content, including the resources, the assumptions around prior knowledge and skills, how that sits when it's delivered outside of its usual context, when you don't have the package of the full degree program and the sort of transversal skills and the peripheral knowledge that's developed through the degree program. Does the microcredential still work as a standalone offer? And in terms of teaching delivery and the student body, are you offering it at the same time to students that are on the degree program and external students? And what does that mean, bringing those two different kind of groups together? But specifically in terms of quality assurance, usually what it means is that these microcredentials are covered by the institution's usual internal QA processes for programs. But I would add that those QA processes should then include some kind of reflection on, as I say, how the module sits when delivered outside of the degree program. The second group is microcredentials that are developed completely independently. And what we see is that this usually falls under an institution's lifelong learning provision rather than their sort of degree program unusual learning and teaching provision. And these might be tailor-made or developed in partnership with external organizations. And from the perspective of quality assurance, quite often these microcredentials fall under the QA processes for lifelong learning rather than, let's say, traditional learning and teaching. And quite often this has a sort of lighter touch approach. So it's worth keeping that in mind, whether the QA is sufficiently robust enough for the microcredential to then be used by the learner going forward and be recognized outside the context of the institution. So a little bit more thought about what all of this means for quality assurance. As part of one of the projects I mentioned earlier, we're developing a set of sort of reflective questions for institutions and for agencies to use when either when having their first internal discussions about how to quality assure microcredentials, or to kind of reflect on whether their existing approaches are suitable or not. We were discussing this as part of the project consortium, and we're quite reluctant to kind of issue another set of guidance or recommendations. There's quite a lot of that out there. So we formulated these as reflective questions in the hope that this would be a useful tool for stakeholders. And here, you know, the first one comes back to this very first starting point that microcredentials need to be fit for purpose. So why is my institution offering them, and who are the target audiences? And then probably the key one is how are the special characteristics of microcredentials captured in the internal quality assurance approach? And when we talk about the special characteristics, these may be around the short duration, the different style of contact with learning, the need for a flexible and responsive curriculum, different criteria for opening and closing microcredentials, probably working with, often working with external organizations or external teachers, different kind of access to learning resources, diversity of learners, different sort of information provision, and the you know, how to ensure that the student voice is heard in internal quality assurance. When we surveyed quality assurance institutions about what they considered as being the most pertinent criteria for internal quality assurance of microcredentials, the ones that were most frequently identified were well-defined learning outcomes, transparent assessment methods, and transparent public information. And I think this public information one is a really important point, because that's probably one of the things that has been lacking a bit in some circumstances. Of course, there will need to be specific considerations for microcredentials that are developed and conceived in different ways, and also reflection on quality assurance of microcredentials that are delivered in partnership with other organizations. the starting principle here is that if it's the institution that is sort of validating the qualification, then they also hold the primary responsibility for the quality assurance. But there needs to be some really clear division of roles and responsibilities between the different organizations that are involved, to ensure that nothing sort of falls between the gaps. But here again, most institutions have existing procedures and approaches for partnerships, and these can be adapted to apply to organizations that they work with to offer microcredentials. For external quality assurance, the sort of set of questions seemed much shorter, because you know, coming back again to this idea of proportionality, there wasn't really a feeling that agencies should be pushed to develop separate and special approaches for microcredentials. You know, that's just not reasonable in terms of workload and resources. But agencies are encouraged to reflect on what is their role in supporting quality of microcredentials within their system. And this might take a variety of dimensions. They might be QA experts. They might be so giving input to national and system level discussions about how microcredentials should be addressed within the higher education system. They might be facilitators of dialogue, bringing together institutions to share practice and to learn from each other. And they might be the providers of support and guidance, to provide some inspiration or guidelines to institutions as to how to internally quality assure microcredentials. Of course, there is also a role for agencies as the bodies offering external quality assurance of microcredentials, and some agencies do that, but I think they are in the minority. Again, we come back to this question of using the existing procedures and to reflect on whether there's some adjustment needed to ensure that microcredentials are covered by the existing approaches. And what we see most agencies have done is integrated some kind of criteria or some reflection on microcredentials into their overall external QA processes. Finally, there's the question about how agencies can support alternative providers that offer microcredentials, and this is quite a bit of a grey area, because the first sort of sub question there is does my agency even have a mandate to do this? Is it my job to do it? And in some systems that is a possibility. Other agencies are offering a sort of voluntary accreditation process or external QA processes for microcredential providers that fall outside the higher education sector. But here I think needs to be communicated and discussed quite clearly what's the benefit and the consequence for alternative providers in having their microcredential quality assured by a higher education body. So a few final reflections to wrap up. The key principles that come out of all of this are really around a balance between regulation, flexibility, and proportionality. I think at the start of these discussions, or when these discussions became really heated a couple of years ago, there was a sort of demand for frameworks, for guidance, for regulation. But there's also some hesitation around that, because the last thing that we want to do is stifle innovation and flexibility by over-regulating. So there's a real need to find a balance there, and particularly when you look at the characteristics of microcredentials as being a place where one can experiment with different modes of delivery and pedagogies, then maintaining that flexibility is important. Communication and transparency of information. I've mentioned already that we see quite often concerns around a lack of transparent information towards students and towards employers about what is the outcome of a microcredential, what are the learning outcomes. And communication can be quite difficult because microcredentials by their very nature are often not situated solely within the higher education sector, but maybe conceived or delivered in partnership with the world of work, and indeed are there so that learners can take them into their professional development. So particularly when we talk about anything to do with the quality of the microcredentials, the formal qualification and the recognition, there needs to be sufficient information and communication, but we also need to be careful about the language that we use. And I catch myself doing this as somebody that sits in the QA world on a day-to-day basis, that we tend to talk with a certain kind of terminology and jargon that is not necessarily comprehensible to those who are not working in quality assurance on a day-to-day basis. So we need to be really careful about the language that we use. And finally, the stakeholder engagement in terms of developing approaches to quality assurance of microcredentials, engaging with the world of work, but also ensuring that there's a place for the student voice, which is much more difficult when your students are engaged with the learning process for a much shorter period of time. So you don't stay in touch with them necessarily in the same way that you might with traditional alumni. And the final point I want to make, and one could do a whole separate presentation on this, is of course that microcredentials are not unique to higher education. And I mentioned already a couple of thoughts about quality assurance of alternative providers. But here again, we need to think about the language that we use, but also not imposing the higher education approach on alternative providers of microcredentials. So I think here the engagement with the sectors outside higher education depends a lot on why other organizations are offering microcredentials. If it's for learners, within a company to, improve their career path within that company, then there's not really any reason that would need to be transferred directly to higher education. But if organizations are offering microcredentials explicitly as a way of accessing higher education or contributing in terms of recognition of prior learning, then that's maybe another discussion to be had. So I leave it there. And I know that Mark will follow me with many more reflections and I think also some more concrete examples. Thank you.
Many thanks, Anna. I don't know if we want to give some space for a question already, or we prefer to pass to the other presentation and we do the question all together. What people think. I see clapping, but means we go for question or we go on. You have to talk to me, people. I don't understand.
I think it's best that we have questions immediately now. Yeah.
Are you ready, people, for some questions for Anna? I mean, it was super clear presentation, so. I give you some second to think, otherwise we go on. I mean, you can always write the question then in the chat, and we'll see it, and that maybe will help to help the shy, and maybe you need to think a bit and consider also we will share the presentation later on, and this video, this meeting is recorded, so come back to us in case you need more time to think. So I give the floor to Mark then, and don't hesitate to write your question also during the speech of Mark, and enjoy. Mark, for now you are muted, but I see your screen fine.
Sorry about that. Hello, everyone, and I guess just to pick up on it, please do post your questions in the chat box so we can kind of multitask a little bit, but hopefully I'll leave time for some Q&A between the two sort of talks. The image I've used here is intentionally to conjure up this idea of the quality police, that when sometimes the word quality assurance is used, it can be misused or misinterpreted. And certainly the intention in this talk is not to adopt a view of quality assurance as some kind of watchdog or policing exercise. What we do know is that quality assurance is a hot topic associated with the hot topic of microcredentials. This just comes from earlier in the year. Yes, it's a US context, but it does seem that more employers are starting to get on board and recognize the potential of microcredentials, but there remain serious questions, and quality assurance is kind of core to this. Earlier in the year, I suspect some of you would have participated or at least joined one of the webinars that Holden IQ have offered over several years now around microcredentialing. They repeated this survey in March. It's a global survey. The sample's not representative, but it identifies just how important quality assurance is as a top barrier to scaling up for institutions. So I don't really need to say too much more that this is an important topic for us to engage with. Remembering also this webinar series throws in AI. Actually, AI, and I'm going to touch on AI in two aspects, because AI could mean artificial intelligence, and I will refer to that, but it also could mean academic integrity. And that's another aspect that we need to be thinking about. What I'm going to share with you are some results of a study to acknowledge that was funded by the OECD in a very short window earlier in the year. There were reasons why the window was very short. And so there are quite a few methodological questions around what we did, but we still think it's a useful snapshot of the state of quality assurance for microcredentials, both external quality assurance, institutional approaches, and then I want to wrap up very quickly with just some of the supports. And we're hearing from Anna, there will be yet another guide or series of questions that we look forward to how they might help institutions and national agencies or regional agencies. Some blatant self-promotion before I get started, because quality assurance is a subset of the kind of leadership that's required for microcredentialing. This is just a journal article we published a few weeks ago that goes beyond just quality assurance, but I do see it as a subset. I can put the link in if you're not familiar with that. To build on Anna's principles, if you like, and this slide here comes very much from the work we did with the OECD. I won't go through all of the bullet points, sort of the framing principles. We don't really agree on what quality is, to pick up on what Anna said. This is a very elusive concept. There is no shared understanding of quality. There's a meta-analysis or several that have been done that come to that conclusion. But the general orientation here is that quality assurance and quality enhancement are almost like hand in glove. And one of the purposes of quality assurance is to lead and support quality enhancement, to develop that kind of, the last bullet point, a living culture, a thriving culture of continuous improvement. It is useful, I think, to be thinking about the differences between quality inputs, processes, resources, and it's generally accepted there's a gap often around outputs. Now that can be a bit more controversial around what you choose to measure, but it's important to consider what outputs we might be using around our discussions in quality assurance. And then lastly, this is multi-layered. I've just taken the rather trite macro, meso, micro, but the nano that's there is, in what I'm going to report to you, a very strong focus was placed on the importance of the learner in this whole discussion, because ultimately one of the outcomes we're looking for is enhanced outcomes for learners themselves, or enhanced quality experiences. So you'll see that come through. So that's the kind of framing. And the work we did this year built on a project that was completed last year. We had an official launch actually this year, but the report that you're seeing in front of you was produced last year. And the foundational question was, we developed these key principles around digital education. The word digital education is adopted here by the OECD as an umbrella concept to cover different modalities that are often seen as blended, hybrid, or online, fully online, if you like. So I'm just using that as an overarching catch-all. And so these principles that emerged from this analysis of QA approaches around the world to digital higher education, how do they apply to microcredentials? So that's the framing sort of question. So what we did is a very similar methodology to the report you've just seen on the previous slide, where we went to have a look at what national, regional agencies charged with quality assurance around the globe appeared to be doing in response to microcredentials. We found in the first category, and there are 3 categories, 25 plus countries appear to have done nothing particularly. There's no evidence that they've adapted their national framework, standards, guidelines, indicators, however you want to describe them, to particularly respond to the emergence of microcredentials. Now, it's quite challenging to here identify whether this is intentional, whether they plan to, but there's no evidence of this. Anna may know more in the European context from the project that she's involved in and the work that ENQA has already done, which often I will acknowledge leading up to this, because we don't begin with a zero-sum game. We actually have some baseline data for Europe. But that's the first sort of grouping. Then the next group was countries that have considered this, or at least agencies that have considered what they should do about microcredentials and have made an intentional decision that the existing common standards, processes, frameworks, and so forth are perfectly adequate and they don't need to do anything additionally. Now, you may be able to tell me there are other countries here that we didn't identify. This was largely desk research followed up wherever possible in the time frame we had with interviews and discussions with people, managers in QA agencies. Spain's a particularly interesting country because there are 2 agencies collaborating. I won't do anything too much here other than give you a couple of examples. In Canada, quality assurance is the jurisdiction of each province. So this is British Columbia, and I've just circled there that they've clearly made an intention in their provincial microcredential framework that existing QA processes can be used and align already for what they refer to as post-secondary education. Ontario, I'm going to come back to Ontario, which is why I'm sharing this slide. Exactly the same approach from the national body. This happens to be covering universities, that they do not require to do anything differently unless it's a new program that they're proposing. So this is actually quite consistent with what Anna has sort of already indicated around a light touch approach, and also the important principle that institutions need to drive quality enhancement and assurance. In Australia, the National Quality Assurance Agency similarly has recognized that microcredentials and their national framework that formally was launched in 2022, there are many elements in which microcredentials really are digitized or online, to take it into that modality. So the national agency has made an intentional decision to integrate online forms of delivery into their national standards, but they've also moved away from being just a monitoring and regulatory body to being an enabling agency by producing things such as a good online learning guide or good practice guide, and notably working with the sector to produce something like that, not sitting outside of the sector. So it's quite a shift. Australia is also interesting because, picking up on Anna's point, microcredentials have been around a very long time, well documented as one of the small studies there showing the older microcredentials. About 2.6 million people in Australia have been doing these for some time, according to that study. And then in Europe, and this is a very fast-moving train, so this is still relatively up to date, but outside of the study, Germany released very late in March its own reflections and guidelines and the implications of microcredentials, in which, whilst they have aligned to ESQ, European standards and guidelines, they left the door open for the potential to introduce something over and above what already exists. But I've already referred to Spain, where you have 2 agencies, probably really a very good model to see how collaboration is occurring, aligned to European standards and guidelines. And then Estonia has this set of guidelines as well, but also aligned to European standards and guidelines. So those are 3 examples from Europe. The third category is where there has been a decision consciously to develop something specific or supplementary to existing quality guidelines and standards. And in this case, New Zealand, Malaysia, and Ireland stand out. For those who don't know me, I'm originally from New Zealand, so it's interesting, the New Zealand situation. It is also important because New Zealand sometimes gets acknowledged as the first country in the world to build microcredentials into their national quality assurance framework, or qualification framework to be more correct. But universities actually sit outside of that framework. And that's a very important point, and I'll come back to that shortly. So universities are given a slightly different opportunity in the way they respond. In the case of Malaysia, I think I'd argue it's probably the most mature. You can interpret that in different ways. Certainly, the guidelines that they have dovetail in very neatly, and the principles to their existing national framework and guidelines for all other modes of delivery. Actually, Malaysia is also interesting because just late last year, they announced that their micro-credential quality guidelines will be extended to these alternative providers, including industry bodies. So that's a kind of work in progress, but that's the evidence of how the agencies, in this case in Malaysia, have evolved in their understanding of what they want to do in the sector beyond just higher education. Ireland's interesting for a couple of reasons. One, Anna's already alluded to this, that the national qualifications framework already accommodated special learning programs or course offerings. And then on another project that I've been working with our national agency, QQI, we've developed these statutory quality assurance guidelines for providers supported by, for programs supported by digital education. Within those supplementary, if you like, topic-specific guidelines that sit underneath the overarching requirements, we've identified and incorporated a number of things specific to microcredentials, but digital models of education. I've just put a box around 3. Learners outside of Ireland, given microcredentials have, many of them are online, there are particular legal and regulatory issues associated with delivering to countries outside of your own. In some cases, it opens up quite serious risks to providers. Online teaching experience, a quality system, you would think would want to ensure that those who do not have experience in teaching online have measures in place and processes and supports to ensure the people designing and offering the microcredentials online have the kind of experience. And then lastly, and I'm going to come back to this last point around equivalency of learning support. This applies to online learning more generally, but in microcredentials, it might be amplified. What kinds of supports do learners have beyond the virtual classroom experience, if you like? There's actually an argument that the ecosystem for online learning is the gold standard of that is measured by all of the other supports that are available for learners, because it's not just the delivery of the curriculum that applies. And then an interesting development, Anna referred to examples of this. This comes from the UK, where the British Accreditation Council has introduced these voluntary standards and indicators that institutions can apply and to have their microcredentials, if you like, certified, or some kind of at least external quality assurance. It's hard to know how many institutions have taken this up. Our desk research wasn't able to reveal that, but it's interesting. And we should not ignore, sometimes I think we do, that discipline bodies, professional bodies, play quite an important role in quality enhancement and quality assurance. This just happens to be the AACSB, which is one of the internationally renowned bodies for business schools. and they are picking up on microcredentials as well. So it's sort of, there are lots of different stakeholders when we're talking about external quality assurance. This table just brings together some of what I've already presented to you. What's important, and maybe where I've got in the final row, mandatory standards, differentiating between standards that are applicable to all providers as distinct from those that might not be applicable to in the same type to universities. And that is the case for Ireland, as I referred to New Zealand as well. Universities really follow European standards and guidelines, and the legislation requires them to be cognizant, essentially, of the national requirements. So that's the state of the play from the desk research we've done. I don't make any claims that it's completely accurate, but it's a snapshot. Looking at institutional quality assurance, and I've got my eye on the time here, I'll go very quickly through this. How do we drill down to what institutions are doing? A quite methodological challenge we faced, and do it in a way that could be replicated in the future. So we solved that problem in that there are several quite high-profile portals, regional or national portals for microcredentials. So that provided a sample for us, and arguably a sample of what would be more mature institutional providers. The fact they're in the portal suggests they're early adopters. So this is the portal from Ontario, where they have almost 2,000 microcredential offerings from almost 50 providers. And we analyzed all of those providers, and I won't bore you with the methodology we did that, to see what they say about their quality assurance of microcredentials, remembering that the institution has been devolved that responsibility. Well, actually, we didn't find a single institution that had anything transparent and visibly available, to use two terms that Anna referred to, about what they're doing. That was quite revealing for us, despite the number of microcredentials. That's not to suggest they are not doing something, but it's not available to either a learner or maybe an industry or employer if they were wanting to see that. Moving to Australia, exactly the same methodology. They launched their national portal, the Microcred Seeker, earlier in the year. It's quite interesting just to verify what I said earlier. In the case of the Ontario portal, I think it was 88% of the offerings are fully online. In the Australian portal, when we did this, 93% of the offerings are online. And it's one conclusion from our study is that the Australian institutional environment was more mature than anywhere else that we could find. And I'll give you one example of that. But interesting, when you drill down in the national portal, the template for their offerings doesn't really say anything much about quality assurance, and some other things are missing as well. So we saw this as a lost opportunity in many respects, especially if you're a learner looking to ask the question of, how can you trust the various providers? Here's just the one example from Australia. We produced several examples, but Charles Sturt University has quite detailed documentation around what it's doing in the development of microcredentials, and by that implicit is the quality assurance. Charles Sturt University is historically a distance education provider, so maybe there's a factor in that as to why they're an early adopter and the level of detail of documentation. I won't share other examples. Moving to the third case study, if you like, we looked in Ireland, where there has been a national project that is well documented in the European context, at least, and is perhaps a lighthouse for what other countries might do. This is led by the Irish Universities Association. At the time of our research, this national portal hadn't been launched, but we went and did a secondary analysis of institutions and drew upon the national portal. Here again, you can see a high proportion of the microcredentials on offer are either online or blended, although the numbers don't quite stack up to the total count, so there must be a little bug somewhere. What we found in the case now, Ireland's only a small country, 7 universities are part of this project, but we only found one university with transparent data available or information on what they're doing around quality assurance. That is not to be interpreted to say the other universities don't have something. It's just not visible, open, or transparent. So some reflections on those 3 portals, and this might go beyond the scope of just quality assurance, but interestingly, none of the portals had rich data for learners providing career guidance. I would argue that that's something that should be considered part of the quality assurance ecosystem. Controversially, for some at least, none of the portals took up the opportunity to provide a course rating that learners could actually say what the quality of the course was, which would be closing the loop and providing some output data. Even if it's only qualitative data, I always look at the reviews of hotels before I book a hotel just to get a sense. The details of the quality assurance processes are not there in any detail at all. Learner support information is a bit of a desert. It's very unclear what support learners would get when they're looking at these portals and the offerings. Maybe you can say it's the horse before the cart, but there's no employability outcomes data. We simply maybe don't have that data, but have they been designed to collect that data? And evidence of a connected system is a bit of an issue in many respects. In the Irish case, the portal was for the universities at this point in time. This slide is just a raft of examples of microcredential development that's happening outside of the university sector that is not part of a national portal that arguably is meant to be promoting lifelong learning. So for us, that's quite a gap that we identified and a disconnect. It also is reflective of maybe the way in which higher education is capturing the limelight when microcredentials, the older forms of microcredentials, have been offered by more vocational providers in the past. Actually, this has reached a point where only a week or so ago in Australia, there was a call to turn off the microcredential portal, the national portal, because of the lack of that career guidance and what some would refer to as recommender systems. Here's the link for me to artificial intelligence, because building artificial intelligence in around career guidance and support might be on the roadmap for many, but it's not evident at this point in time. People like you did these courses to get them to where they want to go with their career goals. So it's quite a gap at this point. The fourth part of the case studies we looked at was the European University Alliances, where many of them we know have microcredentials as part of their outputs. And we couldn't find any of them where there was explicit information, visible information about how they plan to quality assure their microcredentials. Not to imply it's not happening, it's just not visible. So in sum, this is what will come through in the OECD report that we hope will be published by the end of the year. Some of the areas their institutions might need to think more carefully around what they're doing. I've just highlighted a few in bold: workload models. You just don't hear anything about workload models, student experience data, graduate employability data. Maybe the importance of cyclical review of microcredentials, not just the individual ones, but across the institution on a maybe 5-year basis and so on. Haven't got time to go into detail here. Very quickly, just 2 minutes looking at the time. Institutional supports for quality assurance. Actually, this is the good news story. They're almost being published by the week, if not by the month. This one comes from Ontario, a toolkit for providers, and quality assurance is part of it. This might be similar to ENQA, where QAA in the UK have produced this sort of toolkit with questions that institutions should look at and respond to in relation to microcredentials. Here's out of the Netherlands, I think, if I remember correctly, an online website that you can sort of check whether your microcredential ticks all the boxes. Probably needs a bit more development. Just to call out Idatu here, because this was published, I think, in 2022 to provide those co-developed microcredentials across institutions. So this is a very useful resource to consider all the various components. And then the story may not always be what you read on paper when you talk to people on the ground, but the Netherlands national project, what's really important about this one is peer review across institutions is part of how they're planning to do quality assurance. Still a bit of a work in progress, but peer review is a very powerful form of QA. So those are just some examples of what's happening. To wrap up, to put it into sort of 3 categories here, we all operate under frameworks, guidelines, national frameworks. In the European context, we have European standards and guidelines, but I put on the same slide, sorry, Anna, to bastardize the ESGs, but you can see that there are other quality agencies involved. And I've even put there a little logo from the European Accreditation for Engineering Programs, just to flag how we have to be thinking in that multi-dimensional sort of way. In the middle, what Ireland's done by embedding micro-credentials into this framework and guidelines for digital education. And then I'm personally involved with Eden in the microcredentials project that's producing this toolkit for institutions based on the domains that you can see. The question is, how do all these things align? And we could be just throwing a lot at this and overcomplicating matters. Maybe I'll end on that note, conscious that we're not leaving much time at all for questions. So I'll stop on that and see how much time we can at least engage in a bit of Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. I see in the chat already there was a question from Matthew. I don't know, Matthew, if you want to verbalize it, or shall I read it? It's more a comment probably than a question.
No, read, please.
Oh, no, we cannot ask that to our dyslexic, but thank you. So it says, as an external provider of microcredential, which we have built to university qualification standard to make it easier for a higher education institution to put together their, oh my God, you never use punctuation. So in principle is saying, we see that most are enabled to convince the senior leadership that the microcredential can attract more learners and generate more revenues. There are, of course, a few innovative forward-thinking vice, what is VC? I don't know, deans, vice
chancellors.
Okay.
Heads of institutions.
Thank you, Anna. But there is still generally a lot of hesitation despite industry demand to close the talent gap. What's your thought? I think it's for both of you.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, a comment rather than a question. And I would almost sort of reply back with a question, which is this a bit a symptom of I don't like to speak badly of the higher education sector, but is this a little bit a symptom of the sort of university ivory tower thinking that because it hasn't come from the university itself, you know, that they're not engaging with it. It's a microcredential offered from outside the university. So what is it that you're asking from the university that they incorporate it into their offer, or that they recognize it? You know, I think it depends a bit around what is the expectation from the university. But I do sometimes fear that the university sector can be a little bit closed off, and you know, the microcredentials discussion is helping to break down some of those sort of silos, not just between university and industry, but also university and other tertiary education systems, sectors. Sorry.
I think just my quick response is, Anna, you answered this really in your presentation when you talked about fit for purpose, and then discussed the various drivers or attractors are associated with why an institution might be engaged in microcredentials. Unless you can answer the question why, then you don't really know what fit for purpose is. So the question or the statement there, what isn't so much about quality assurance, it's more about why you're involved in this. But it's crucial to know why, because you won't know what it is you want to be looking at from a quality perspective otherwise.
See an ends up from Mayred. I hope I said correctly the name. Please go ahead.
Yeah, hi, listen, thanks very much to both of you for your presentations. Just maybe a few comments. I think it's really, really important when analyses are completed that maybe the basis of comparison is explained, because thinking about, say, the national project in Ireland, the microcreds, which essentially is a shop window, that's subjective and that's why it's there. So it's not specifically objective, is to outline QA processes for all of which have been developed for QA, and we've developed that as part of the framework. So I think from a really, really important perspective is to disaggregate two different things, because I don't think there's a comparison of like to like, just in case there's any misinterpretation from that. And then speaking from our own institutional perspective, we have up online all of our QA processes with respect to micro-credentials. We have to make some of those potentially may need to be more explicit for the learner. But as a university, we take it for granted in Ireland that all of our offerings, whether they're short form or long offerings, are QA'd and are ingrained in our QA processes. So for specifically where if we had a learner who would come in to do a postgraduate, we wouldn't expect them to go a postgraduate long form course. We very rarely expect them to go and say, well, I need to find out the QA processes that are in the university, and therefore I need to go. We wouldn't, that's not what postgraduate students would do. So we think there's a little bit of maturity needed perhaps in this, and I think we're doing a lot of work with employers for them to understand about micro-credentials. So when we say that they're offerings from designated award bodies or from validated trainers and accreditors, I think coming back to Anna's point beforehand, that there's already inbuilt in lots of our systems. So not the differentiating, we haven't done that differentiation. We wouldn't expect that differentiation. And I think it'll come more with the maturity of the market. And maybe Anna and Mark might have a comment from their overview of Europe and then the other countries that Mark was looking at in the study that he completed. They might have of where the maturity of the markets are at, because from our perspective, there's still quite a long bit away before that maturity has reached a level by which, you know, where we need to have some form of very explicit quality, because a lot of the employers in Ireland would accept quality being ingrained by quality by education and recognised education and training providers. So potentially it's a moot point. So we just have to be careful, I think, one, from the objectives of why portals such as microcred is up there. I think that's really, really important. And secondly, then to understand the market more, because some of the generalisms here may not apply when you look at a more sophisticated markets in education.
Thanks. Marie, also, I think we have to close the session of today, but first of all, closing, I want to thank the speakers of today, Anna and Mark. I'm personally a bit surprised that there are not so that there are still references to the quality assurance is missing, as this is a mandatory part of the under what is a micro-credential under the European Commission's definition. There must be a reference on the type of quality assurance, so there will be improvement in that, I guess. For those who are interested to go further and deeper into the topic of micro-credentials, but also on topics of hybrid blended education, international collaboration, online assessment, and so on, we can also refer to, and I'm going to put that in the chat, to an offering via the Digital Education Hub. Oh, one moment. Is this a link? I'll just place it there. Can you check if that is a link? No. I'll try it again. One moment. I'm going to. You do have that link, Alessandra, or not?
I can Google by putting.
No, I'm going to send it to you so that I can further close. One moment.
In the meanwhile, I can say to the audience that tomorrow you could use the same link for the event, because there is the day 2 of this micro-credential event. So if you have logged in today, you want to hear more about the future of micro-credential using artificial intelligence, which was very nice, your remark. Academic integrity is also something important, but won't be that AI. So you can use the same link, and anyhow it's posted on our, there you see. Okay, now is a link, George. Yeah, you go ahead.
And I can further explain. So this is a link to where you can find further information and meet with experts also on micro-credentials, but on as well on other topics like online assessment and so on. And we offer there clinics, which are 2-hour sessions with an expert, or we offer mentorship programs, which are 3 times 2 hours on a certain topic that can be supported by a case study from your institution. Really interesting to participate in that. We from last year's webinar session, 15 of you joined these sessions with great appreciation of what they found there with the experts. So it's a 2-step registration there, first to the hub and then to the clinics or mentorship. So highly recommendable. Alessandro, you already announced the program for tomorrow, who we are speaking to.
Yeah, tomorrow we have Jan Lutz from NTT and Anthony Fisher Camilleri, that will enlighten us on the future of microcredential, a perspective on how artificial intelligence will definitely change microcredential. We will have a more overview from Anthony talk and a more detailed technical, but not scary technical, from Jan. And it's very interesting because there are also linked with the ESCO Europass. So stay tuned, really. I'm sure it will be a delightful day also tomorrow. So you can just use the same link. And if you don't find it, just connect with us on social media. I know I have asked many times to turn on the camera. Will be fantastic if you just do it now at the end. Then we do a nice screenshot of this event and just say hello. Everybody likes pictures, so come on. There you see. Even if you're in a restaurant, just turn on the camera. Good, good. I love it. I should have said before, man. Okay, so I'm gonna do ask. So say cheese in 3, 2, 1, cheese. Done. Thank you, guys.
Thanks. See you tomorrow at 2 o'clock then.
Yeah, see you tomorrow at 2. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.